Is it lighting up red?
Yep.
Bam. All right. Thank you, man. Thank you. Good. Here we go. This is my lesson for tomorrow when C. Webb is here. So,
Oh, where are you going?
I got to go present at a conference in Greensboro.
Well, good.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. All right, everybody. Moving on to absolutism in Japan. I know sixth period, you guys didn't get all the way finished with the Ottomans. We'll figure that out as soon as I get back. Japan is a little different. We haven't talked about them since we left Japan after the Nara, the Heian period, Minamoto, Yoritomo, and all that. And we're going to introduce a new character, Tokugawa Ieyasu, this handsome-looking general here. And Japanese absolutism will last from about 1600 to 1868, roughly just after the United States Civil War. And what had been going on in Japan was a series of civil wars over who the shogun was going to be. And part of the problem with the shogun is a lot of the peasants were caught up in the fighting because they were rebelling. And all this is going to come about by a policy known as the natural policy of seclusion. And there's a story of the three unifiers. Here's your story of the day. There is the head shogun general at the time named Nobunaga. His assistant was a guy named Hideyoshi. And the third guy in line is the star of our show, Mr. Tokugawa Ieyasu. And the three are sitting by this campfire early in the morning trying to decide the best way to govern and unify the giant Japanese archipelago, these series of disconnected islands. And all of a sudden, a little songbird lands on this branch. You know, the sun is coming up, and the three generals look at it, and Nobunaga says, if that songbird doesn't sing soon, I'm going to get up and I'm going to kill it. Nobunaga says, no, that's not the way to do it. Or Hideyoshi, rather, says, if that songbird doesn't sing, I'm going to get up and I'm going to make it to sing. I'll force it to sing. And Tokugawa is sitting there quiet and patient, and he says, well, I'm going to wait for the songbird to sing, because when it does, its song will be the most beautiful of all. And that story is meant to show the differences between the three men. Nobunaga was just going to, if you didn't like it, he was going to eliminate you. And Hideyoshi was going to force you to do it. But Tokugawa says when the time is right, it will be nearly perfect. And it is Tokugawa Ieyasu, as Nobunaga and Hideyoshi are killed off, that will emerge as the leader of a unified Japan right about 1600. So again, all of these guys from, you know, Mayhead and Suleiman to Akbar to Charles V, you know, Queen Elizabeth, the Stuart dynasty, Louis XIV, all of these guys are happening. Things are happening right about the exact same time. And it is here that Tokugawa is going to build a new capital city in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. It's going to be the new capital, a new period for Japanese history. And Tokugawa will take the title of shogun, and he will use his vast military power to recreate and reorganize Japan. When he is done, when Tokugawa establishes his Bakufu or his tent government, everybody is going to fall into line. He's going to reorganize the entire country. And he does another thing in 630 known as the National Policy of Seclusion, where he says, you know what? Everybody else stay out. We here in Japan have come about as close as we can to perfecting society. So we do not want any outsiders to come in. Few people left Japan, and few people were allowed to enter. A few Dutch missionaries. The penalty for being a foreigner, a gaijin landing in Japan, was you were simply beheaded. A few ports were restricted for Chinese and Dutch traders. This idea was much different than what had gone on in Japan for many years, where again the young men were sent out to be educated and returned. Japan willfully cuts themselves off. This was exactly what happened to Western Europe during the Dark Ages, except they didn't do it willingly, where Japan does. Now, because there are a series of islands in archipelago, it makes Japanese isolation much more easier to enforce. So during the age of absolutism, it was much easier for Japan to truly focus only on what they were going to do. So, Tokugawa's in charge. He cuts Japan off from the rest of the world, and the second thing he does is he is going to redraw the domains. Remember, a domain is the territory or the fiefdom that a daimyo controls. Well, Tokugawa will go to the 229 enemies whom he defeated, and he confiscates their land. He just takes it from them. He moves the defeated daimyos from one domain to another. And when he does, he breaks the link between that daimyo and his supporters. I'm taking you from your kingdom where all of your people and your supporters live, and I'm moving you from south to north, or from north to south, so you no longer have any supporters to back you up. And so Tokugawa is going to create 3 domains. In the middle, all right, and this is a large picture, the painting of Tokugawa's final victory. And when he was done, it was so definitive, there was no one who had the ability to question Tokugawa Ieyasu. So he controls the largest domain. He chooses the biggest one for himself. He used inside this, first ring of defense, many long-lasting, long-trusted supporters, daimyo, and as much as 17,000 other samurai who had been his supporters for a long time. Their loyalty had been proven over time before he takes the title. So he's going to choose this red domain as Tokugawa's domain. It is the biggest and the largest. And he is insulated on this inner core ring of defense. The second level, if you look out here, kind of the yellow and the green, will be the second level. And this level of defense were his family members, his nephews, or people who had a direct bloodline to the Tokugawa Ieyasu family. These members were linked directly to him, so they were nieces, nephews, second and third cousins that form a second ring of defense. And then way on the outer edges, in the blue and kind of the lime green and way up here, is the third ring. And this was formed by people who had fought against Tokugawa Ieyasu in the civil wars, in the War of Reunification. Again, they were moved from their traditional homelands and they were put on the outer edges of the empire for 2 reasons. Number one, if an outside invader came, they were the first ones to get it. Or, if they wanted to rebel and attack Tokugawa, they had to fight through his rings of defense. They had to go through his family members and into his hardcore inner ring of supporters to get to him. It made it nearly impossible. So, Tokugawa has a great plan. He puts it into place, and by building these 3 rings of defense, he has set the table to be a dominant, absolute monarch. He's not the emperor, he's the shogun. This time the emperor is still up there doing whatever the emperor does. And so this is kind of a difficult thing to understand, but Japan at this time parallels Europe in two different ways. If we look at France, France had moved from a pattern of feudalism to a greater control and central authority. Louis XIV had destroyed the nobles' power on the national level. He made them beholden only unto him. He was completely and totally in charge. So Louis XIV and Tokugawa run the entire national system. But Japan also resembles the decentralized German states. It's a balance of absolute monarchy and independent authority. Over in Germany, we have those 360 states, that state for every day of the year. And in Germany, local princes had to control their local populations. Well, Tokugawa does the same thing. Here I am, like Louis, in charge, centralized, I'm taking care of national problems. But like Louis did with, remember we used Brian and Jessica as our examples, they were supposed to take care of their own local little problems. National authority will be handled by Tokugawa. Tiny little things like if the stoplight is out at Homestead Road, well, that's the responsibility for the local daimyo. And he was able to balance both, if that makes sense. It's kind of complex. If you have questions, please let me know. So, now that Tokugawa has built his 3 rings of defense, he's cut society or Japan off from the outside world. Now, how is he going to run his government? How is he going to control his daimyo? Well, one of the first things that Tokugawa does is that he is going to draw up new legal codes. And these new laws are going to regulate his governmental bureaucracy. Everything is going to be spelled out, similar to what Mehmed and Suleiman had done in the Ottoman Empire. And so to make sure he gets the help that he needs, Tokugawa wants men of ability. I want smart people who have an aptitude for leadership in government. Just because your dad was a governor doesn't mean you should be as well. He wanted good men of ability. And so he looked for guys who had leadership experience running their samurai warriors. Whose daimyo ran the best? Who had the fewest problems? Whose samurai are loyal to him? Who controlled their different domains? And so a daimyo who was chosen by the shogun is elevated to an important position. But just like we heard in the Ottoman Empire, when you are selected and chosen, when you are a man of ability, you and your samurai are held to a higher standard. You must be the absolute perfect role model because you are there for a reason. So, a chosen daimyo, one of Tokugawa's chosen people, had to live life frugally, right? They couldn't wantonly spend. They were forbidden to get drunk. Excess drinking is forbidden, as was gambling. And they had to ask Tokugawa permission to do anything. Can I add another layer to my castle? Can I add another defensive tower? Some even had to ask permission to get married. And Tokugawa reasoned all this out. He plotted all of this because these were men that he chose to be members of his government. He had to make sure he picked correctly. They had to be role models for all of his people. And to make sure there's no shenanigans, Tokugawa creates the hostage system. Louis XIV started it, Peter the Great kind of did it, but it's Louis and Tokugawa who really take this to a whole nother level. The hostage system is where those daimyos from the outer third ring of defense, the guys on the edges, his former enemies, they are forced to come and live in Edo, all right, by Tokugawa's castle for 1 year. They live right there where he can keep an eye on them. The next year after that, they are able to return to their daimyo where he sent them. But their families must remain behind in the capital. It's called the alternate year attendance plan. That way, if you try to lead a rebellion or you do something horrible, I have your family hostage. It's insurance that you will not try and overthrow my authority. And so, with his foot placed firmly on the gas pedal of his, or on the throat of his empire, Tokugawa is clearly in charge. Now let's try and help everybody else out. And from the beginning of his reign in the 1600s, all the way through his next 2 or 3 immediate successors, Japan, because of what Tokugawa does, will experience a great period of economic growth. When there aren't wars happening, when you're not spending a lot of money fighting wars or repairing damaged roads, bridges, trying to replant fields where crops have been destroyed, you can take some of that money and you can focus it on yourself. When we don't need to militarily spend, nobody's bothering us, let's focus on ourselves. And so better tools are created, shovels, pitchforks, and rakes for the people to go out and use. Technology, all right, a grain thresher to separate the grain from the straw, from the chaff. We can get better seed, we can get better fertilizer, and crop yields are going to grow. Tokugawa had gained access to many resources that had been for a long time geared for war. He now puts them into the civilian sector. And agriculture and farming begins to improve, and the population begins to double. And Tokugawa was determined to not only control every aspect of Japan, but help it grow. And the entire country, because he is the force of will behind this, falls in line behind him. Japan has national unity, second only to Louis XIV. Everybody pretty much clearly depended upon what Tokugawa Ieyasu was doing. And there is an immediate boom to the Japanese population. The population, as always, more food equals more people. And as a result, for one of the first times ever in a long time, merchants are allowed to start trading again. During the civil wars, they would most assuredly get killed. So the economic growth, trading between cities and parts of Japan grows by leaps and bounds. They were not afraid to travel. Goods and services can go north and south. Merchants will revive trade, and in Japan will be one of the world's first national economies where goods and services are being traded throughout the empire. All of this is due to the leadership of Tokugawa Ieyasu. And what's funny, it is the alternate year attendance plan that is an unwitting benefactor to this whole thing. Having the daimyo travel from their home daimyo 1 year to Edo the next, and the next year back out to their domain becomes an economic success. These daimyo unintentionally begin to encourage overland trading. As they went back to their homelands, they needed towns to stop in. They needed restaurants to eat in, hotels to sleep in. They wanted better roads to speed communication and travel from their home daimyo to the capital and back. So roads and bridges are constructed. Water wells, hotels, new towns spring up to make and facilitate the moving of the daimyo, while it also helps trade and travel. Old barriers that had put in place to break down and isolate economic regions are now gone. And so by the end of the 1600s, the political reorganization of Tokugawa Ieyasu was finished. And it is here at this point that the Japanese believes no new changes are necessary. Everything is as good as it can get, so the national policy of seclusion is clearly working. And kind of very similar to Akbar, Tokugawa was absolutely brilliant in the way he set up his bureaucracy. He was able to maintain that balance of central control as the shogun and those decentralized states that I talk about. If you remember, Tokugawa is technically working for the emperor. The emperor is still the head of the country. But it's the shogun who's calling the shots. And Japan is unique in the way that no daimyo ever tried to overthrow the shogun or the emperor. So dominant and entrenched that they were, that is where loyalty lied. That's just simply how it was going to work. Tokugawa and Louis XIV were smart enough to know that they could not micromanage everything. So he had to allow the daimyo to handle their own domains. There were just things that they had to be able to handle, and he had to have the trust and the faith in them to allow them to do it. Tokugawa took care of national problems. Tiny local problems were best left to the daimyo. If you guys remember, I'll tell you the story about a thing known as the 47 Ronin. Maybe we'll do it today if we have time. And the other thing is that only a samurai was able to hold governmental leadership positions. There was a tight, rigid control inside the Japanese government. Tokugawa and his successors knew they could not do everything. So he looked for, again, to make sure that only high-level samurai, noted for their skill in leadership, attained a position where decision-making was necessary. When you reach a certain level, you have the knowledge, the skill, the power, and Tokugawa's authority to make a judgment call. But he wanted to make sure he had the very best guys in place to pull that off. And so the problem is, while everything is set, everything is in place, Japan is running absolutely smoothly. But what nobody understands is when you change society and you're unified, some of the way you're accustomed to doing things has to go.